Welcome, everybody. Today we'll be talking about canvassing. Canvassing can take place in a number of ways, and we'll talk about the different ways that we do canvassing in democratic politics. And thank you all for joining us. So the agenda for this meeting, first, for those of us on the call that are a little bit newer to campaigns, we'll review some of the core functions of a modern political campaign, like we do in democratic politics. Next, we'll learn different ways that the organizing and field team on a campaign canvasses on doors, on phones, by text, and relationally, and we'll explain all that and go into more detail. And then finally, we'll go into depth on specifics of the different canvassing techniques that we're talking about, with examples of real-world software, as I was talking about with one person, the vote builder software that people use to make canvassing and phone calls. So first of all, how do modern political campaigns win votes? So, of course, modern political campaigns have overlapping functions that develop core messages, recruit volunteers and endorsements, and talk directly with voters. Many of these, of course, work hand in hand with one another, and all are critical to the overall function of a campaign, just like, components of any other machine or organization are, they all help each other get to the overall goal. So first of all, the thing that we'll be talking most about tonight is organizing in field, and that gets out the vote. So that talks directly with voters, recruits volunteers to make phone calls. For example, this picture from 2012 of a volunteer making phone calls with Barack Obama using literally a landline phone back then. And as I was saying, we had paper call sheets. So you see the paper with the columns of data. Those are phone numbers and names that they're making calls. And yeah, that's how we used to do it. And then, political manages relationships and earns endorsements. So, for example, we have a campaign manager on the call, and they might be looking for different organizations that are doing endorsements, or they might be inundated with emails from a variety of organizations that are looking to do questionnaires and things. So, the political team, especially on a larger campaign, manages all those relationships and earns those endorsements. And then research is a group that finds opposition dirt. So, for example, our state party has a dedicated research department, and their job is to find things that are embarrassing or, in a normal world would disqualify somebody from running for office. So, for example, in Minnesota, we are in Minneapolis, Minnesota right now. And there was recently a story where there were two state representatives on the Republican side who had problems with alcohol, and one, I think, was charged with driving under the influence, and another one could have had a firearms charge that could have been a felony, but the local jurisdiction decided to not prosecute. So. Those, of course, could be disqualifying to some people, but not in that instance right now. And they're both running for re-election right now. And then finance raises the money and manages donor relationship. So, for example, when you have a nonprofit organization like your local food shelf or your church or anything like that, they'll have a group of people who might be a treasurer, might be different fundraising people that host events or manage the list of donors and send thank you cards and stuff like that. So that's dedicated people that raise money and manage those donor relationships. So here's just talking more about organizing and field and getting you kind of in the mindset of how do we get the large groups of people involved with things? How do we get their contact information? What kind of carrots do we do to bring people in and get people excited? So, I was trying to find some more information. Of course, I have my own memory of what happened in 2007, but there isn't a lot of information still about Barack Obama's campaign in 2007 and 2008. There's a website that he developed or that his team developed called my.barackobama.com. And back in 2007 and 2008, they had a system where people could use Facebook. So back then, this was before Cambridge Analytica and all the scandals with that. But back in 2007, people could invite their friends to basically follow the campaign. They could invite them to events. They had a map of all the events in the local area. And there would be, of course, volunteers who would host events, and they would use Facebook to collect contact information and then share it with the campaign and build that email list. So things have changed since then. You can't necessarily scrape Facebook for that contact information, but Bernie Sanders has kind of followed up on those kind of techniques, and they have a map of their events, especially when he was running for president. They'd have events across the country, and you see this on Democratic campaigns with the website Mobilize. Mobilize is owned by the same company as the Vote Builder software, so they work together. So people who sign up for volunteer events through Mobilize then are added to volunteer lists on Vote Builder, and can also, through different data sharing, be for different kind of voter mobilization and whatnot. So basically, the idea is these events, as you can see, the photo here is a Bernie Sanders event in a rural area, but you see it's a local high school or some kind of college or something. Actually, I see NCAA, so I guess it's a college. And so they have a lot of people attending this event, and they are bringing new people in with online streaming. So you might have to sign up to get an online stream, or of course, all these thousands of people at this event. And so then they recruit members of the community to be volunteers. So when you're thinking about your own local campaign, you might have events like, you might have a barbecue that is just, friendly community event, brings people in, brings people into the campaign, gives them a first way to talk to a candidate or talk to many candidates if there's a group of candidates or elected officials or whatnot. And then they might become a volunteer that way. So bring them in with something that's fun, just like this rally seems to be a fun activity. And then kind of step them up, just like joining any other organization where you step up over time and get more involved with things. So, here are some of the ways that organizing in field contacts volunteers. So, modern political campaigns use many overlapping techniques to reach new supporters, including volunteers and voters. You can think of this as an ever-expanding circle of connection, from the most enthusiastic first adopters to voters who actually just make up their minds after Labor Day. So we'll dive into each method. So, first of all, there's relational organizing. So, relational organizing, when we're talking about the word relation, we're saying one person knows another person directly. So, they're a friend or they are part of a community organization together. For example, your church or your different other kinds of fraternal or relational groups. So, these are the people who know the candidate best and advocate on those issues. So they are ambassadors. They are bringing people in one by one as their friends and neighbors. So relational organizing is where those ambassadors reach out to their friends and other potential supporters to recruit them for upcoming events or volunteer opportunities. So for those of you who are on a campaign right now, I know that one of you, you became the campaign manager because you lived in the same neighborhood as the candidate, and she asked you to join the campaign, and you knew each other already, and that was great. So that was a relational organizing, bringing people onto the campaign. Next is earned media. The reason why I included the second is because it's actually kind of tangential to relational organizing in the modern sense. So in the past, earned media was only through more broadcast channels like a newspaper or a television or things like that, where you're getting your name in the news and people are learning about you and stuff like that. In today's context, it actually includes social media. So the idea that people see somebody share something from a candidate or from a friend of a candidate and all that kind of stuff, and they learn about different candidates that way. And I would actually argue that's maybe the number one way that people have that discovery of new candidates is through social media and people sharing that content, and are not necessarily happening through traditional media like newspapers or television or the radio or something like that. So social media is a large part of this, and many early adopter potential supporters see that political content first on social media and not their local newspaper. And then we have door canvassing. So door canvassing, as just a definition of it, is when we walk through a neighborhood. So the word canvass means to walk through a neighborhood, talk to people. Like you canvass a group of people to ask them their opinion of something. That's the word canvass. And so door canvassing is where we walk a neighborhood or go in an apartment building, and it is the beating heart of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Organizing. So the in-person, human-to-human conversations we have on the doors is why we can persuade voters to vote and vote for our DFL candidates. And so there are two main methods, neighborhood canvassing and apartment canvassing, and we'll discuss those more on a later slide. But the reason why this is kind of farther out from the circle is because, of course, when we knew people first and they came to that event, like a barbecue, or they saw something on social media from a friend, that was where they're closer in. But now we're talking about canvassing where we have to get farther out and reach out to people more affirmatively. And so that's a little bit different. Then we have phone canvassing. So phone canvassing is another way that volunteers directly reach individual voters. However, call answer rates are dropping. We were talking about today at a meeting where the organizer was talking about how, they were, supposed to be calling folks to ask them to volunteer, but they themselves don't necessarily answer every call. And so it's kind of, how can I ask somebody to answer the phone when I don't want to answer the phone myself? And so the cost of making calls on an auto dialer can be about $15 per thousand dials. So it's still cheaper than mailers. So even, let's say, for example, that just doing the rough math, if 10% of people answer the phone, then equivalent, that's like $150 on a thousand dials in terms of like actual conversations you have. Um, versus if you sent mail to those thousand people, that would cost, around, $500 to $1,000. So you can see where it's like, even if you don't necessarily have everybody answering the phone, it still can be a cheaper way to reach out to people. And those conversations are more impactful because they're actually a human to human conversation versus mail, a lot of it goes in the recycling. And then we have text canvassing. So the same idea as phone canvassing, but on text messages. And I do mention this not as necessarily a positive example, but as something to watch out for where, you know, uh, many Democrats, once they have given money to one Democrat over time, like, or the party or anything like that, then they seem to be flooded with text messages asking to donate to different Democratic groups or progressive groups overall, all that kind of stuff. And it becomes a tidal wave. And that's why some smartphone software now has text from unknown numbers go into a separate inbox. So if you have, 10 text messages today from, random groups, those might be in a separate inbox and somebody might check it once in a while, but they don't necessarily respond to it. And so that has made text messaging much worse return on investment because it still costs around 2 or 3 cents per text message sent. So it's actually more expensive than calling. And so if people are seeing it less and deleting it more, then that's kind of not very helpful. So here's door canvassing with neighborhood canvassing. So as I said before, there's two types of canvassing, neighborhood and apartment. Neighborhood canvassing is in block neighborhoods with walk-up doors like single family and duplex. So as you can imagine, like we see in this photo here, Canvassers go in teams of two usually, one for each side of the street. Or if people feel more comfortable with a certain neighborhood, maybe they split up a little bit farther. But depending on what people's comfort level is, and of course the time of day has a impact as well. If it's during the middle of the day, like at 1 p.m. on a Saturday, some people might be feel more comfortable walking in a neighborhood alone. But if it's 5 p.m. and it's near election day and it's getting darker, then usually we don't actually kind of go out when it's dark or whatnot. So canvassers have literature, maybe with a shoulder bag. I think there's maybe, yeah, there's a shoulder bag in this photo, and good walking shoes. So depending on the political geography, doors can be targeted or every door in some neighborhoods. So um, for Democratic candidates, for the general election, this year there's primaries for everything. So in the general election, typically there'd be only one Democrat. And so then there would be a Democratic candidate for governor, a Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate. In those instances, and we'll talk about this with apartments too, depending on the neighborhood, you might knock more doors. But then in a more Republican area, you might be a lot more targeted in what doors you knock. And, of course, with the geography, they might be farther away. So here is a case study. So I just took Waite Park. This is where my father grew up. He went to Waite Park Community School, which you can see on the map with Waite Park, the actual park. So my family grew up in Waite Park, and my father went to that school. So in this example, we canvass a random sample of voters in his neighborhood with two turfs. So just to be clear, the dots on the map are real voters, but it's just random voters. It's not any particular demographic of voters. So for most purposes, this is kind of random dots on a map, because there's voters at most houses. But it gives you an example with real stuff of how people create turfs in the Democratic National Committee vote builder software. So in this example, I just took a couple blocks around his old house. And so we have, 20 doors on one and 15 doors on another. I think turf one, if I recall correctly, the 21 out of 20 refers to that there's 21 voters at 20 doors. Um, but don't quote me on that. I think I'd have to double check that. But essentially, that's the idea. And so you can see where you would have, two turfs that people can work on. Obviously, these are pretty small turfs. In reality, where there'd be more dots that you'd be going to, you'd have more doors and that kind of thing. But this is an example of how that kind of works. And then you would target those doors, especially if you were trying to do something that is requires a different demographic of like maybe voters who are you're trying to persuade them to vote, or maybe voters that vote every election or something like that. And then here's apartments canvassing. Apartment canvassing takes place in larger multifamily buildings with multiple doors on each floor of the building. So in Minneapolis, we are in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I live in an area with a lot of buildings that have, kind of like one long hallway, and then there's a lot of apartments on either side of the hallway. And what we like to do is where we go out in teams of two. Well, actually, there'd be a lot of people. Like here, you have four people at this canvas here. But you can have two people on a hallway. And then what we tend to do is like we start at different ends of the hallway and then make our way to the middle, depending on the building. And so canvassers have literature, so you can see the literature they have here. Again, here's another shoulder bag, and of course, good walking shoes. Typically, with apartments, the turnover is high enough that it's best to canvass every door and then enter voter data or register a resident to vote. So, typically, renters are more Democratic voters if they do vote than single family or duplex houses. And so the idea is that we're trying to get as many people to vote as possible. And so if somebody's not registered to vote, then we can register to them to vote either online or in person. Oh, and just admitting somebody who jumped out. And so we enter that data. Um, and so because they're more democratic, the thing is that we're trying to get them to vote overall. So that is what we do there. So just talking more about the apartments program. So I've been involved with the Minnesota DFL Coordinate campaign in Minneapolis, and we have consistently had a dedicated apartments program. So that is separate from other canvassing programs for other parts of the state. And then there's also other kind of community programs that are for different affinity groups that are also kind of not necessarily on the ground for field, but things like community groups, events, and things like that. Like, for example, with veterans or something like that. So, for our apartments program, we have a standard information packet that we send to the property manager. And I have a database of property managers in the local area. And then other staff members have, different lists that they've worked on. And of course, this changes from year to year with new apartment property managers and ownership. So, for example, I know one building across the river that um, just it was more memorable that they had switched ownership, and so everybody like the staff were the same, but the emails all changed to the new domain address of the property manager and owner. And so, what we like to do is to have residents often receive emails from their property managers with what to expect. So, the idea is we can give them like a PDF document, they can attach it to an email, and then we get better responses on the doors. So, then, of course, what we covered in today's training. So, to recap everything. So, first of all, we reviewed the core functions of a modern political campaign. Then, we learned different ways that the field and organizing team canvases on the doors, on phones, by text, and relationally. And then we went to in depth on the specifics of each canvassing technique with some real world examples of the Vote Builder software and kind of how the working with property managers for apartments works and stuff like that. So now we'll have time for questions and answers. And so I will stop the recording.